Hello, welcome to the latest Noir series of short author interviews with authors we like, basically. My name is Nick Quantrill. I'm one of the festival co-directors and author of the Joe Geraghty series, set in my home city of Hull. And our guest today is Oliver Harris. Oliver is the author of the London set DC Nick Belsey trilogy, and more recently, the Elliot Kane espionage series. The first one, A Shadow Intelligence, was published in 2019, and the new one, Ascension, is published this July by Little Brown. And I've got a proof copy here, Oliver. Is that the cover? Is that the final cover? I don't know if it actually shows the way on the camera.
Yeah, pretty much. They might try and squeeze a quote from someone on there, but yeah, I'm quite happy with that cover.
Yeah, it's really smart. I like the colours, and it kind of hints at the storyline quite nicely, doesn't it? With the remoteness of Ascension Island. So yeah, let's pick up the story then about Elliot Kane, who was the protagonist in the story. It's the second in the series, isn't it? So it kind of, I think it stands alone really well as a novel, but it does sort of pick up from A Shadow Intelligence as well, doesn't it? So just give us a bit of an introduction to where Elliot is at the start of Ascension.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea behind Elliot Kane was trying to create a spy that alongside all the kind of the gung-ho action skill sets, he's got quite an academic background. I was really interested in spies and the amount to the extent to which individuals are recruited into the intelligence services, often from a languages background, an anthropology background, the individuals with a real interest in foreign cultures. So I wanted Kane to have that side to his personality, which took him, partly the reason he ended up in Kazakhstan in the first novel in the pursuit of a former colleague. Ascension finds him kind of the dust of that escapade settling, and he's tried to leave the intelligence services for good. Started a kind of a long-awaited PhD in Oxford, and he thinks he's escaped that world, and then that world comes knocking because it needs his help. And that's because an individual he's worked with previously appears to have taken their life on Ascension Island, this very remote outpost of the British Empire in the South Atlantic. And then he came to go over there to find out what exactly has happened.
Yeah, well, let's talk a bit about the island then, because it is a really fascinating location for a novel, isn't it? It's kind of, it's not an island I particularly knew an awful lot about before I picked up the novel. It's kind of sort of in the shadow of the Falkland Islands, I guess, isn't it, in the South Atlantic? So kind of, was that a location that you knew about and wanted to deliberately write a novel set there? Because it becomes almost like a locked room mystery, doesn't it, in its own way? Because once you're on the island, there's no way off, basically, for 30 days.
Literally. So it would be a long swim. Yeah, I mean, the reason I wanted to write about it was precisely because until I found out about it, I didn't know anything about it. Like, it's one of those places that's not on everyone's radar, like pun intended, I think.
Yeah.
But I probably came across it researching GCHQ and this whole area of the intelligence services that's slightly less written about in fiction, certainly, than MI5 and MI6. I got very interested in this huge kind of communications empire that Britain maintains abroad, and the extent to which so many of our existing overseas territories are connected to surveillance of one type or another, whether that's kind of Cyprus or the Falklands themselves, the mysterious business that goes on in the Chagos Islands and Diego Garcia, and then Ascension, which just by virtue of its remoteness was fascinating. It's essentially a volcano halfway between Africa and Brazil. It was of no interest to anyone until the Napoleonic Wars, when the British imprisoned Napoleon on St. Helena, which is the next nearest island, still hundreds of miles away, but they wanted Ascension just in case the French tried to launch an attack. And then they clung on to it. No one had wanted it previously because it's got no life there. There's no one living there. There's not even water. But the British, being the British at the height of empire, thought we can use this and poured huge amounts of energy and industry into making it livable. But it came into its own first in the Second World War as a landing strip when the Americans arrived and developed it hugely for their own Air Force base. And then this odd historical period after the Second World War, as we enter the Cold War, and suddenly the technology becomes so arcane, so unknown, but very concerned with space, with satellites and with radar. And Ascension acquires a huge significance then, but not one that the public would ever hear about.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of, I don't, maybe I'm thinking unique, maybe it's not quite unique, but nobody actually lives there, do they? There's no actual residents on the island. It's kind of a staging post where people just pass through for a certain period of time, which again gives it maybe a different character, because crime fiction's tied to place a lot of the time, isn't it? But this is very much a place where transient people are constantly coming and going from.
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice way of putting it. It has this, as you say, very transient community of approximately 800 people, mostly working in some way in connection to one of either the British base or the American base. But with this community of saints, as they're called, families from St. Helena who come over to do a lot of the service industries around it, the catering, maintenance and things like that. And they are, families, they're allowed to bring children. Some of the British and Americans will have children with them. So you do get this kind of veneer of a established community there, with a school and a post office and a church. But as I sort of discussed briefly in the novel, no one's allowed to be there permanently. No one's allowed citizenship. When your job is done, when your contract's up, you're off the island. And there's been disputes over that in the past. People have tried to put it on a more secure kind of democratic footing and take some ownership. But individuals are sometimes over there for decades, but they have no kind of rights. So, which is interesting itself. Why do we still? Why is it now even more transient than it was before? It almost feels about to kind of. There was a period of time when you could visit it as a civilian. You could actually get the RAF flight direct from Brize Norton, and that's no longer the case. It seems like it's becoming ever more remote, and I was curious as to why that was.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it, that remoteness of it, and the whole kind of lack of an infrastructure in a society kind of gives it a very different feel to other places. And that's the environment that Elliot's literally dumped on, isn't it, at the beginning of the novel? So he's sent there by a former colleague, Catherine Taylor, because a former colleague of theirs has committed suicide, but there's a suspicion that there could be more to the story than that.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think I was interested this time around with drawing upon some of my experience writing crime novels and using that mystery thread in an espionage context. When I kind of dived into spy thriller slightly naively with a shadow intelligence, I hadn't appreciated quite what a challenge it is figuring out what the structure of a spy novel is. With a crime novel, there's a fair sense there's a body at the start, there's a mystery, a death, and a resolution to that at the end, but no clear equivalent for a spy novel. And the sort of rough parallels, like the hunt for a double agent or whatever, felt very hackneyed and overdone. So with this, I think because the setting itself felt so interesting on its own to me, I didn't want to owe too much plot around it, forcing us away from Ascension. I wanted, there's nothing like a missing child in this case for bringing an environment into very intense, painful focus and a community into focus. So it just seemed the perfect vehicle. A twist that felt novel to me on several tropes: the isolated environment, the island novel, the missing child novel, and Ascension is such an unusual setting that seemed to add enough of a new twist to that for it to be fun to write.
Yeah, and I think what I really liked about the novel is that it takes something that's, like I say, very kind of personal and close for the spies in the story for Elliot and for Catherine. It becomes very much a global story as well, doesn't it? Because I don't want to say too much, I don't want to give away the story for readers, but it connects kind of to a very big global issue, and maybe that's strategic importance in the island that you're talking about. But yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about the plot as it develops without kind of giving too much away?
Oh, this is dangerous ground. I mean, again, looking at spy novels and thinking about them at greater length and in more depth, part of the appeal is clearly this contrast between very localized events and global stakes. The classics of the Cold War, there's such intensity watching these scenes play out in tiny cafes in Eastern Europe, knowing that two superpowers are kind of bearing down upon these individuals. It's a genre of scale and differences in scale. So that fed into Ascension. And I don't think it's giving away too much to suggest that the novel looks to some extent at space and the space industry and the increasing role that's going to play in our lives, and espionage. And I came across some really interesting parallels between the colonization of the world, and Ascension being a prime example of that, and the colonization of space that seems to be ahead, and disputes over ownership and disputes over what mankind does once they attempt to take possession of the things they discover. So both elements seemed amazing stories of exploration and discovery, and stories of destruction and pettiness as well. As you say, a contrast between a tiny island and the greatest realm there could be.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the actual research, and was it book based? Because it feels like the island is very vividly rendered, but I'm guessing you didn't get the opportunity to actually go to Ascension Island, where maybe
No.
the first book you went to Kazakhstan to do some research.
I did go to Kazakhstan and had all these Kazakh anecdotes ready, and haven't had the opportunity to really regale people with them this time around. I'm endlessly asked, did I go to Ascension? And all I can say is that I tried incredibly hard, including applying for grants, and trying to figure out how I'd fit a month on the island into my schedule with a young baby on the way. And it proved impossible. By the time I was kind of biting the bullet and thinking maybe I can do it on a credit card, this one, it's 3 flights each way, and they only line up once a month, which is why you have to be on there a month. Each flight alone is incredibly expensive. So I didn't get there, which is really sad. But to some extent, I think any writer might understand that there's a certain advantage in working with a limited amount of source material, and being forced to use your imagination. The nice thing about Ascension is, while very few people get there, those who do often write really interesting blogs about it with a lot of photos.
Yeah.
So I had just the right amount of material. I wasn't swamped with stuff that I felt I ought to read. There's only kind of 5 or 6 books out there, and I was able to get hold of them. And with a map pinned to the wall, and the benefits of Google satellite images and everything, it was actually really fun imagining myself into it.
Yeah, you've talked about the link with space exploration, and that kind of been a big kind of frontier in terms of driving geopolitics. Is that type of storyline difficult to find as a writer? Are you kind of constantly searching for those little kind of trying to anticipate future issues and future sort of global wars and territories and so on, to try to generate ideas for novels when it comes to spy stories?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for me, it's a big part of the appeal of the spy genre, is glimpses of the future and the kind of the challenge of trying to outpace the information in the public domain. Actually, kind of when I was looking at structures of spy novels and spy stories, I was looking at the Bond movies, and really impressed at how a lot of the Fleming novels were talking about technology really ahead of their times, including a lot of the satellite stuff. I mean, in all honesty, I probably shouldn't be trying to keep up with that. I'm the least techie person. I'm not a futurologist. The individuals who manage to do that, and there's not many, tend to be coming from a background in a related field, and I'm not. And there's no reason why an effective spy novel should have to depend upon groundbreaking technology and weapons of unheard dastardliness or anything. I mean, the really interesting with the Shadow Intelligence is I was kind of searching around thinking, what is the core of the novel? What's the weapon that is going to be the weapon that defines this era? And realized I was kind of looking at it online and all the disinformation campaigns. This was kind of 2016-ish. and psychological warfare seemed then an incredibly new and scary thing. It doesn't seem so much now. But I think you can drive yourself a bit crazy with this. And while the stuff you're coming across online might now be familiar to people really researching these areas, the general reading public are still going to be interested in anything cutting edge. And given that my spy novels seem to be set in the 60s, I feel like modernizing it shouldn't drive you around the bend too much.
Yeah, and one of the interesting thing as well is that we talk about the cutting edge of spy thrillers and technology and so on, but in Ascension and with a lot of other crime spy novels, things keep going back to the Cold War, don't they? That kind of distinction between the two sides. Is that maybe a kind of a comfort blanket, do you think, in terms of the world's becoming ever more kind of fragmented and difficult, but Cold War gives us kind of a more black and white world to latch onto, an understanding that we can maybe grasp?
I mean, I think, in all honesty, it's because it still plays out. I mean, Russia still is of such significance, and now with China, once you're in that realm of geopolitics, it's hard to avoid coming up against the big players, and they divide still along relatively Cold War lines. And then there's the question to which the smaller scale fragmented hybrid stuff, whether that is independent operators and to what extent the strings are still being pulled by the old players. And that's a question I kind of actively explore in both novels to some extent. But for sure, there's something comforting about having Russia as the baddie again. And a lot of work, I think, to be done thinking beyond that kind of paradigm. But if you're working, with a protagonist in a state intelligence agency like MI6, having them coming up against, lone cyber hackers feels a bit asymmetrical. You need whoever the baddie they're up against needs to be as big and scary as possible. So you end up slightly being channeled along two lines: the nation state superpower, or the Bond-style lone oligarch billionaire with their own schemes. And it's, some individuals have tried to find an interesting twist on that. Huge networks of kind of anonymous, obviously terrorism is another one. They're all kind of pitfalls I wanted to sidestep. So it's amazing how you do get drawn back into the same patterns of Cold War division.
Yeah, does that make it more difficult to create rounded characters in a way? Because, to be kind of something like Elliot in MI6, he has to be have a very strong moral code, don't they, the spies. But, and we're seeing the novel Catherine Taylor, who's his sort of former colleague. She finds herself in a tight spot as well, and she's choosing effectively between a country and Russia. Without saying too much about the plot. I mean, does that kind of, those dividing lines make it difficult to create characters? Is there kind of grey areas that you can slip into?
I hope so. I mean, I think when I started writing Kane, I wanted him to be quite a morally ambiguous character, but for a lot of that immorality to be done in the service of his country, if you see what I mean. So I almost wanted to turn that on the head, and the grey area as to what extent should we be supporting these schemes of the intelligence service in the first place. I don't think there's ever an excuse to have kind of two-dimensional moralistic characters. The challenge is more having complex antagonists. I really dislike baddies, but thrillers make it very difficult to avoid them if you're going to build suspense and a satisfying resolution. But to sort of go back to the previous question, it feels quite ethically dubious constantly just attaching baddies to other countries or other religions, faiths. So yeah, it's an ongoing question. Where does that leave the thriller? How do you structure a thriller that's conscious that the world doesn't divide into good and bad so simply, while delivering thrills? That's a question that really interests me.
I think, John, sort of broadening the discussion, spy fiction seems to be seems to have like a golden era at the moment again. It seems to be an awful lot of great espionage writing around. Do you read other spy fiction writers, or is it something you try and keep away from as so it doesn't sort of dilute your vision?
No, I'm always on the hunt for new spy writers. Adam Brooks, I thought was great. Charles Cumming. Very curious to see the new Le Carre novel that apparently
yeah, that's going to be interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Just anything that's out there. Partly because there's this question of subject matter, perhaps more than any other genre. Well, I'm sure science fiction faces equivalent challenges in terms of to what extent you need to be on the cutting edge. But it's really interesting to see what other people are writing about. And it's interesting to see this, what seems a resurgence of interest, perhaps slowly building since kind of 9/11. But certainly now, and perhaps coming out of 2016 and a lot of the Russiagate stuff has made people really see the potential for a new wave of spy fiction.
Yeah, and obviously before the Elliot Kane novels, we had the trilogy of the DC Nick Bilsey novels. So, gun to your head time, police procedurals or spy fiction. What's kind of is there a preference there as a writer?
Well, I've just finished writing the fourth Belsey novel, which has been really fun getting back to it. I'm looking forward to doing a bit more spy stuff. Once you've got used to that really big canvas and the opportunity that gives you to really explore contemporary themes, contemporary political themes, and some fascinating locations, it becomes really exciting to write. And writing a police procedural set in your home country starts, to feel slightly constricting. But I mean, that's only a comment on my own limitations currently. When I return to police procedurals, I'd love to find a new way of unearthing an equivalent breadth to them. There's so, it's an endlessly fascinating genre. It's so fun to write. For me, in the short-term future, I'd love to do a couple more spy novels.
So is there a difference in terms of when you're writing? Do you find there's a different approach to writing those novels? Because maybe it's fair to say spies maybe observe more, but police detectives have to act, certainly, possibly. I don't know, maybe there's a distinction there between the types of characters you're writing about. Is that maybe fair to say, or do you not see it in those terms?
I was certainly drawn to similarities between them both as heavily dependent on observation. That it's an interesting question. I don't know. I think both could be whatever you wanted to make them, in all honesty. Both can be profoundly cerebral, both can be profoundly action-based. And that's what attracts me to them, that you can play it both ways and modulate over the course of a novel. In terms of whether it feels different writing them, it's feeling different with each novel, to be honest. When writing the fourth Belsey, I think I was taking quite a lot from the experience of writing the Kane novels. I'm basically trying to force myself endlessly out of a very linear single point of view structure, which I kind of started with in the Hollow Man for the sake of just getting the first novel written, and then found myself slightly kind of stuck in, but because it's very effective. It's the most powerful structure there is, but it slightly ties your hands as a novelist. I read these novels set across, 4 different protagonists in 3 different centuries, and I'm like, wow, that's a lot to play with, And I look at, I'm still waiting to write a novel that takes place over more than 2 weeks. So, that's my next challenge. And I thought the spy novels would help me with that, but in themselves, they don't, because the demand of keeping the reader gripped is still there. And once you've got a ticking bomb, so to speak, it's very hard to break away and have them chilling a year later. So yeah, that's the next puzzle I need to solve, is an expanded chronology.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure we'll wait and see what you manage to do with that now. I guess that'll be the next Elliot Kane novel, all being well. So we'll draw to a close there. Thank you very much for your time, Oliver, and to tell us all about Ascension, which is out in July from Little Brown. And we urge you all to go out and buy it. Thank you very much, Oliver.
Thanks so much, Nick. That was really fun.